Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, one of the most interesting things to me this season isn't within the gameplay itself necessarily, so much as just the way that the changes to items within the game in Season 4 have completely reshuffled the hierarchy of item rarity. Rares are garbage now that are pretty much not worth picking up outside of salvaging, uniques are weirdly mostly underpowered, and legendaries are king. So today let's talk about why that has happened, whether or not it should be fixed, and some ideas for how that could be done if so. The main topic within this then is honestly about uniques specifically, because we have just hit a stage in the life cycle of Diablo 4 where for the most part uniques seem to be completely obsolete. The main reason for this then is tempering. Tempering is a new mechanic where on any gear below unique rarity, you can choose to apply up to 2 bonus affixes to the item of your choosing from set listings, which are the manuals. Tempering in itself is a whole other topic, of course, but the main things that relate to this are that tempering affixes are both extremely strong in general, and the customization themselves of getting to choose 2 of them on every item is incredibly powerful in itself. Not to mention that a lot of the strongest tempering affixes simply cannot be found on gear without tempering, and these can be build defining. The reason this makes uniques a lot worse in general is because, well, you can't temper affixes onto uniques. They come with 4 affixes by default, instead of 3 that the legendary items come to try and even this out, and the actual rolls and the affixes on uniques are higher as well. But on the vast majority of them, that does not make anywhere close to enough of a difference by any means. The simple result of this is that any unique that isn't essentially build-definingly powerful, providing an effect that makes your build function in the first place, is almost always worse than just having a legendary item in the same slot that is purposefully made. In prior seasons, it was still a bit shaky a lot of the time. There were lots of reasons to use legendaries over uniques just because of more controlled affixes and a lot of legendary aspects being as strong as some unique effects. But this has tilted the balance far further away from being in favor of uniques. This means things like Tybalt's Will, which was essentially used entirely for the damage boost, are completely out of favor. Obviously that item was nerfed as well, but even aside from that, and even a number of uber uniques are affected by this, with things like the Grandfather actually not being a best in slot item as a weapon for pretty much anyone except pretty specifically bleed Barbarian builds. And honestly, weapons are the place that this has hit the absolute hardest in general, because legendary weapons have weapon affix temper slots, and these tend to hold affixes that can be as build defining as any unique, or even more so, all on their own as one slot of an affix on that item. So outside of essentially just Barbarian and occasionally Rogue, due to those classes having multiple weapon slots to compensate, nobody is actually using unique weapons really at all. Another interesting note here is that Havarion, the uber unique staff, which before the season was predicted to be one of the strongest possible items for the main activity, which is the Artificer's Pit, and pushing it, after all, a free shrine effect just constantly, is extremely potent. But this was dropped from most people's minds for a few reasons. Firstly, the shrine duration increase affix was just removed from the game entirely, so you can't have permanent uptime on this effect. But more importantly, again, it is in the weapon slot, and it means that you can't temper it. And even with genuinely particularly strong affixes on it as a base, it's still just worse for most builds than having a legendary weapon with well-rolled tempering affixes on it. There's a similar problem with the Ring of Starless Skies, much less so. It is still finding its places here or there, but rings tend to have 2 very strong tempering affix slots, so replacing a ring is quite hard right now. This has essentially invalidated most of the uniques in the game. Of course, there are exceptions. Most builds will run 1, maybe 2 uniques at most, and that is often including their uber uniques, even for the very end tier versions of the builds. Of course, I know there are builds that will use more than this, I know, but on the whole, uniques have just become far worse items in comparison to what legendaries are right now. With all that said then, is this a problem? Is it a bad thing? Well, yes and no, really. As a base concept, you do want uniques to be strong. They are listed as being a higher item rarity than legendaries, so you want them to feel like that, especially uber uniques. It should be exciting when a unique rarity item drops, especially again in uber. But right now, it has about an 80 to 90% chance of just being irrelevant to not only your specific build, but any build you would consider playing on that class, and that's really not a great feeling at all. That said, in a world where all the uniques were of relatively equal value to each other, I think it would be fine balance-wise at least. I think it's perfectly acceptable for average builds to have 2 unique items at most if you make them strong, if they make the build do what it does to begin with and sort of give you a template to build around with your legendaries. I definitely prefer builds that have 2 uniques compared to ones that we had like last season's that were just nearly full uniques that we had in some cases, but I think for it to truly work there does need to be some better balancing between these items. It's all well and good to make legendaries so powerful that only build-defining uniques are worth using, but at that point you need to then change every other unique to also be that sort of level of build-defining with enough variety that they can't be pushed together in some sort of cheesy way that then invalidates legendaries. And honestly, that's an entire mess of balancing to consider. So while it is, yes, in theory possible for the game to proceed like this with a current heavy skew towards legendaries being better, it is without a doubt something that I would consider to be a problem, and I think the devs probably agree. So how could it be fixed? Well, there's one really good option that I think is just genuinely extremely simple and more than enough to get the job done here, which is let people temper uniques. I definitely think it would be a step too far to make it have the exact same rules as ancestral legendaries where you can put 2 tempered affixes on, at least unless they made uniques also have 3 affixes base or something like that, because obviously 6 total affixes in the end would get hard to balance pretty quickly all in itself. But I think the good solution here is 1 tempered affix. This is the simple version of it. This lets weapon uniques come back into the fold a little bit by letting them use weapon affixes. It lets jewelry uniques be used a bit more without sacrificing the important utility of things like resource affixes, and all of that is extremely important because for the most part the only slots that I see people using uniques in right now that are, again, not entirely build defining is the armor slots where you can only even have utility and defensive tempering to begin with. An extra note is I think that even with 1 tempered affix only, unique should have the same number of rerolls as a legendary at the least, so you can really sort of refine that singular affix to be what you want on a unique to make it actually have its proper value. You can even go a step further and have it so uniques, well, uniquely, don't brick, so you don't run out of rerolls. Just make them have infinite tempering chances. So you just sink materials in over and over until you get your perfect roll. And even past that, I think you could go even further than that and make it so that while uniques can only have 1 tempered affix, they could potentially be from any of the categories. Say, for example, you've got unique boots, you'll want to put a weapon temper on. That might be too far, but I think that is another thing that is in consideration. Another thing that you could have is just a way of defining the system even further and putting some sort of difference between legendaries and uniques. And even then, this level of consistency, I don't think is far enough to swing the pendulum back to uniques being so strong that builds will be stuffed with them and minimal legendaries. I think it still puts them on relatively equal footing with them, but just makes them far more attractive in specific ways. Because right now, I see this as being a problem. The way the gear has changed, functionally speaking, has just invalidated the majority of the uniques in the game as far as being usable items for anyone who actually cares about the stats of their character, at the very least. And while it could work with pitch perfect balancing in the game, we definitely do not have that. And so that's honestly a very simple and plain solution that I think would easily fix this system and at least make the balance a bit more even between item rarities, even if not quite perfect either. Obviously, I'm not a game designer, I know that, but I think this would make it a lot closer in a relatively simple way of achieving it as well. I hope you've all enjoyed this discussion then, everyone. Let me know your own thoughts on the strength of legendaries and uniques currently in the game, the wave of tempering power, and how this sort of just devalues even the concept of uniques and uber unique items. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.